Calling it quits, a Danish energy developer scraps plans to build 2 offshore wind farms off the coast of New Jersey. Why the company decided to ditch the project, we'll explain. Plus, some Midwest farmers are saying no to planting cover crops. We'll take a look at some of their concerns. And in Kenya, we'll explore how an invasive species of cacti is being transformed into a new eco-friendly enterprise. Hello and welcome to EarthX News, where we focus on sustainability and the environment. I'm Christina Thompson. Let's get into some of the biggest headlines facing our planet. First, to an update on a story we told you about weeks ago. New Jersey's plan to build 2 offshore wind farms is coming to an end. Ørsted, the company behind them, announced. Now, it's a pretty big blow to the state's push to transition to renewable energy. The project had been on shaky ground for a while as it battled protesters, high inflation, and soaring interest rates, which were enough to make the planned Ocean Wind 1 and 2 projects no longer profitable. Wind farm developers are balking at the losses they face due to high inflation and rising costs. Ørsted estimates it will need to write off as much as $5.6 billion as it abandons the project. Next, some troubling news for parents. A federal appeals court on Thursday is tossing out the Environmental Protection Agency's ban on a pesticide that has been linked to brain damage in children. The courts say the EPA needs to consider whether there are cases where the pesticide can be used safely. The chemical is called chlorpyrifos. It's part of a family of nerve agents developed during World War II, and it's used on plants like soybeans, broccoli, cauliflower, and fruit trees. The EPA banned it back in 2021 after multiple studies highlighted the risks not only to children, but anyone who comes in too much contact with the agent, including farm workers. Canada also initiated a 3-year phase-out back in early 2021. The chemical will be fully banned by our neighbors to the north this December. Meanwhile, one environmental group is raising the alarm about pesticide drift in Iowa. Pesticide spray drift is the movement of pesticide dust or droplets through the air to any site other than the area intended. Now, the U.S. does have restrictions on how close you can spray to schools or parks where kids play. But a new report says that 22 Iowa schools are too close to farm fields and at risk of coming into contact with dangerous chemicals. The EPA says they rigorously test pesticides to ensure they're safe for people and the environment. And farmers, they're told over and over again that cover crops will help them build healthy soil, help the environment, and help fight climate change. Cover crops are grown on farmland that would otherwise be bare, helping to stabilize the soil and lessen pesticide runoff. Now, the practice is also key to government efforts to sequester carbon in farmland to help reduce climate change, since planting the right off-season crops can pull carbon from the air and keep it underground in plant roots. But after years of incentives and encouragement from the government, farmers in the Midwest only planted cover crops on about 7% of their land in 2021. Their fear is the additional costs and negative impact on their cash crops. And studies indicate that those fears may be warranted.
Anything in farming is based around cost. Everything you do, every move you make, every time you get into a piece of equipment, the cost is considered, because none of this stuff operates for free.
Researchers use satellite data to examine over 90,000 fields in 6 Corn Belt states, and they found cover crops can reduce yields of cash crops, bushels per acre. Now, the smaller the yield, the less money farmers make. The U.S. Department of Agriculture paid out nearly $44 million in 2023 for cover crop programs, with additional funding coming in through the Inflation Reduction Act and other federal crop insurance coverage. USDA officials acknowledged that planting effective cover crops can take time and will require some experimentation, but believe farmers who continue their efforts should see significant benefits. The National Resource Defense Council is now encouraging Congress to give farmers more lucrative financial incentives to plant cover crops. Lack of fresh water can also create supply chain issues and disruptions in global trade. Just take a look at Panama. A drought has left the Panama Canal without enough water, which is used to raise and lower ships. forcing officials to cut back on the number of vessels they allow through on a daily basis. Now, some shipping experts say vessels may soon have to avoid the canal altogether if the problem gets worse. Less passages could take away tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue from the Panama government, push up the cost of shipping, and create the environmental impact when ships travel longer routes. Now to a story out of Kenya, where an environmentally hazardous plant is being put to some good use. A group of women in the country are taking the prickly pear cacti and transforming the cactus pulp into an eco-friendly biofuel. The solution helps eradicate the cactus while promoting environmental conservation. Harvesting the invasive species has even provided jobs for the women who dig up the plant. Local farmers say the plant, which is covered in spikes, is harmful to the livestock which try to graze on it. They also say the plants reduce grazing areas, hamper wildlife navigation, and jeopardize community lands. And some new research finds a set of forest conservation projects are falling short of expectations. Researchers say roughly 94% of the carbon credits from over 24 project sites surveyed on 3 continents did not represent real reductions in carbon emissions. That's according to a recent study published in the journal Science. Verra, which is the world's largest carbon credit certifier, blasted the scientists' findings, calling the process they used to arrive at that conclusion flawed. However, Verra added it was in the process of overhauling its own standards. To help me better explain just how important forests and forestry is to our planet and all who inhabit it, I want to welcome in Congressman Bruce Westerman, chairman of the House Committee of Natural Resources and the only professionally trained forester in the House of Representatives. Chairman, thank you so much for coming in.
Christina, so good to be with you and great to be able to talk about one of my favorite subjects of trees and forests and the benefits that they have to all of us.
Well, you're the only licensed forester in Congress. That's incredibly cool. How does your background help to make our government a more well-rounded and more balanced when it comes to conservation?
I've actually got a kind of a strange background to be serving in Congress. My undergraduate degree's in engineering, and I'm also the only licensed professional engineer in Congress. And I went to graduate school for forestry, so I'm the only licensed forester in Congress. I joke with people and say that engineers think with logic and reason, and foresters look at long-term horizons, and sometimes none of that's appreciated in Congress, although I think we need a lot more of it here.
What's something that you wish more people understood about forestry and just how relevant it is in society?
Yeah, and trees are so important to us. When we think of the environmental benefits of trees, you know, Teddy Roosevelt called forests the lungs of the earth. Through photosynthesis, they breathe in carbon dioxide. They combine that with hydrogen and water molecules, and they store hydrocarbons in the trunk of the tree. They breathe out oxygen that allows us to have fresh, clean oxygen to breathe. And once that hydrocarbon's stored in the wood, it stays in there until that wood is either burned or decays. And if you look at the energy that we use every day, even the fossil fuels, according to what we understand about science, all carbon in the fossil fuels went through the photosynthesis process through some kind of plant, that either that plant was stored underground or it was eaten by an animal that was deposited underground. So even our fossil fuels come through this photosynthesis process where we get energy from the sun. So forests play a critical role in air quality and water quality, and also for wildlife habitat. I like to say that forests are a win-win-win situation. When we have healthy, vibrant forests, it's good for all of us on many different levels.
I'm sure your background also offers such an immense wealth of knowledge, especially when it comes to our government. And I'm sure you're very busy. I want to know, what are some bills that you're working on now that will benefit forestry, and conservation?
We've got a bill that's called the Save Our Sequoias Act. These giant sequoia trees that only grow on the western slopes of the Sierra Nevadas out in California. We've lost 20% of them to wildfires in just a 2-year span, and some of these trees are over 3,000 years old. We know from a lot of scientific research that the problem was mismanagement of the forest, and it's when we started putting out the fires that would take out the low-growing understory on a regular interval, we started suppressing those fires, and these white fir trees and other species grew up into the canopy of the giant sequoias. And when the fire came through, that's what we call ladder fuel. They got up and burned the crowns of these sequoias and wiped out whole groves. So we've got a bipartisan bill to go in and do the management on these sequoia groves to protect them for the future. We've also got a wildlife habitat bill that I'm working on. You hear people talk about recovering wildlife or saving our wildlife or our endangered species, but really what you have to focus on is the habitat. If you fix the habitat, then you give the species the best opportunities to survive. A lot of things that we can work on when we talk about water, like in the Colorado River Basin, we have to look at forest management along that watershed to protect the water going in and to produce more water. So I think forestry affects people's lives a lot more than they realize that it does. And it's also a great solution for the future on how we manage carbon. Forests are that intermediary in the carbon cycle. And we know that when we build with wood, we're storing carbon like in a battery in a wooden building. But there's also some innovative products like biochar that can make soil more productive or have more productivity through better water retention and nutrient retention and available for plant uptake. And at the same time, biochar will last in the soil for well over 1,000 years. So there's a lot of new solutions that we can have to the problems that we face today if we go back to an old friend of our forest that have benefited us for so long.
An old friend of our forest. I love that. Congressman Bruce Westerman, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We appreciate it.
Great to be with you. I'll come on and talk about trees anytime.
I will hold you to that. We'll have you back. Coming up, the growth of clean energy is expected to put some stress on America's electric grids. Just ahead, we'll take a look at what the U.S. Energy Department is doing to hopefully relieve that pressure. We'll be right back. Total energy consumption is on the rise. The Department of Energy is now allocating $1.3 billion to 3 different projects to try to upgrade our outdated electrical grid. But it's not nearly enough. Current predictions vary greatly, estimating somewhere between $1 and $7 trillion is needed in upgrades to bring the grid up to date with our current load. Not to mention what is needed as energy consumption and demand inevitably increase as even more renewables come online. Renewables are currently at their highest demand and expect to see that demand doubled over the next 30 years. Here to help me dig into this topic even deeper is the former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Neil Chatterjee. Neil, thank you for coming in, for talking with us today. I wanted to ask, with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, we're seeing energy production become a popular topic of discussion, particularly renewable energy. But what gets less attention is our grid. Why should people be concerned with the state of our grid's infrastructure?
Well, the reality is there's a widely cited Princeton study that's showed that almost 80% of the projected emissions reductions that are expected to emanate from the Inflation Reduction Act would not be realized if we don't triple the pace at which we build transmission in this country. The reality is we need a lot more transmission to get clean energy onto the grid, and that's been a real challenge.
I mean, if you look at those estimates, right, to get the grid modernized, they're saying it could be as high as $7 trillion, as low as $1 trillion. Why is there such a large variance? And what's the difference about how renewable energy ties into our current grid infrastructure?
It's just hard to build things in this country. There'll be different challenges in different regions of the country. Siting infrastructure is a challenge because it's not political, it's not ideological. NIMBYism, not in my backyardism, it's across the board. Americans don't want energy infrastructure cutting across their property, whether it's a pipeline to deliver natural gas or a transmission line to deliver clean energy. The challenge with renewables is a lot of the renewable capacity, whether it's offshore wind or large solar or onshore wind, are regions of the country where there's not that much demand. We need to build transmission lines to deliver that clean energy to where the demand for that power is. And that's going to take a lot of work and a lot of investment.
I mean, speaking of demand, it's continuing to grow. But if you look at our grid as it is right now, 70% of it is 25 years old or older, a quarter of a century. How can we ensure availability and reliability for the future?
So look, our grid is old, but I still think it is, like, truly, if you look at the grid in the eastern United States in particular, it's probably the greatest invention ever made by mankind. So I'm proud of our grid. Our grid is stable, but it has challenges. And one of the big challenges now is that in the energy transition and moving towards cleaner sources of energy, we are retiring the existing sources of generation that we've relied upon for decades. And in some instances, we are retiring that generation before the replacements are ready to go. And that is leading to some reliability challenges on the grid. And it's something that we need to be very cognizant.
I think so too. Despite pumping so much money into the grid, the U.S. transmission growth is actually down 0.5% over the last 5 years. Now, in order for the U.S. to reach its decarbonization ambitions, there will need to be a 5.7% increase annually by 2048, and the national transmission infrastructure would need to expand 60% by 2030. Is this possible?
Sure, but it's going to take some reforms to the process. My former agency, FERC, is working on this. I would like to see permitting reform out of Congress to just make it easier to build things in this country. It's just too hard. And the reality is Americans need this infrastructure, and we just got to find a way to modernize the process, or else we will struggle to get this infrastructure sited.
In your opinion, what's the best way to bring together both viewpoints on this, the left viewpoint and the right viewpoint?
Look, I think there is an easy compromise to be had here. Yes, in the short term, modernizing our permitting process would better enable the build out of natural gas pipelines and natural gas infrastructure in the short term. But in the long term, it will better enable the build out of the transmission lines that are needed to get clean energy onto the grid. I think that's a solution that works for all Americans. We are going to need natural gas for the foreseeable future, for energy security, for reliability, for affordability. I think natural gas complements renewables well. I think there is an easy deal to be had here. We just need to cut out the hard left that wants no fossil fuels and cut out the hard right that doesn't want to acknowledge climate change. I think those of us who are, thinking about this rationally in the middle, there's a definite deal to be had.
Neil Chatterjee, great points. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And coming up, a nuclear testing site in Kazakhstan has been closed for decades, but efforts studying the aftermath are still underway. Stay tuned because we'll take a look at what scientists are saying about the current radiation levels in the area and the impact it's having on the environment and human health. A nuclear testing site in Kazakhstan remains a blunt reminder of Russia's arsenal as scientists continue to study the aftermath of more than 400 atomic explosions, with people in the area still feeling their effects. Correspondent Alex Salvi explains.
Nuclear weapons are making their way back into mainstream conversations through entertainment and real-life threats. Just this week, Russia successfully testing an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of carrying nuclear warheads from a submarine, just days after officially withdrawing from a nuclear test ban treaty. It's reminiscent of the days of the Cold War, when the world lived in fear that Armageddon was imminent, delivered by one of the most powerful weapons the world has ever known. Perhaps no one is more aware of the might of nuclear bombs than residents of the former Soviet territory of Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, known as the most nuked place on Earth. The first Soviet mushroom cloud rose over the area on August 29th of 1949, a time where the United States and the USSR teetered on the brink of war. Semipalatinsk remains the only site in the world where people lived after and during nuclear testing. I saw that the explosion was in the form of a mushroom. There was a big explosion. We saw black smoke rising into the sky, and we were told, don't look. The territory is home to 456 nuclear tests over 15 years. 340 underground and 116 in the air, with the total power more than that of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Japan.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
While the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought an end to the nuclear tests, it was only when Kazakhstan gained independence that year that the effects of the trials came to light. Lake Shagan, the so-called atomic lake, was created by one of the tests carried out in 1965, with its water and all the products of the blast being used for livestock grazing up until 2005. The safe zone is nearly 40 miles away from the epicenter of the test site, but remains the only test site in the world used for agricultural purposes by locals. After specialists from the National Nuclear Center conducted research, it turned out that part of the territory was absolutely not subjected to radioactive contamination. Although radiation levels are no longer elevated in most areas, children continue to be born with genetic mutations more than 30 years after the cease in nuclear testing. Official data shows the number of new cancer cases in Kazakhstan increased by 30% in 2021, with Semipalatinsk taking first place in that statistic. There was an increase in cancer diseases in direct proportion to the radiation dose, as well as congenital malformations. And then children began to appear born from irradiated parents. There's no definite answer in science as to how long this negative impact will last. Life goes on for many residents in the region, knowing that there's not much they can do to change their fates largely decided in the past. This community in Central Asia offers a small glimpse into the possibility of what could be if nuclear weapons were ever used again. For EarthX, I'm Alex Salvi.
And before we leave you, a touching moment from Australia's favorite wildlife family, the Irwins.
This is one of the highlights of my entire life. This is the very first Alcea irwini, Irwin's turtle, ever hatched. My dad would be stoked with that.
That is 19-year-old Robert Irwin, the son of late wildlife expert Steve Irwin. Robert announcing over Instagram that a rare turtle hatched at the Australia Zoo. His late father found the rare species of turtle on a hunting trip back in 1990. That's it for this edition of EarthX News. Please join us again next week. I'm Christina Thompson.